Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kendall Trump with Grain Journal Magazine in Decatur, Illinois. Welcome to How Fatigue is Impacting Your Business. This is the ninth in a series of webinars to be presented by GEAPS and Grain Journal Magazine in 2019. Today's webinar is sponsored by M&M Specialty Services. M&M specializes in protecting your people and your products with the best in quality and affordability in personal protection products, grain protectants, fumigants, and services. They are based in Leavenworth, Kansas. This webinar is also sponsored by VAA LLC, who has provided engineering and design services in the agribusiness industry since its founding in 1978. Working with owners, equipment vendors, and design build contractors, the firm specializes in bulk commodity handling facilities, including slipform design, material handling, transportation, and export. They are based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Our presenter today is Emily Whitcomb. Emily is a senior program manager in the advocacy department, leading the fatigue initiative for the National Safety Council. She develops strategy and executes programs to manage fatigue as a contributor to preventable deaths. Whitcomb consults with employers, travels the country giving presentations, and regularly conducts media interviews. Her research has been published in multiple peer-reviewed journals. You can participate in our Q&A session today by typing questions into the box on your screen at any time during our presentation. We will be addressing your questions during a Q&A session following our presentation. We do have two polling questions for you today. First, how many people are viewing at your location? And second, are you a GEAPS member? I want to thank you all for your participation in our polling questions today. As a note, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to our website, grainnet.com, within 24 hours. All registrants will also receive an email containing a link to the recording the day following our presentation. We will now begin our presentation today. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Emily Whitcomb.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Kendall, for that introduction. As Kendall mentioned, my name is Emily Whitcomb, and I head our fatigue initiative here at the National Safety Council. If you're not familiar with our fatigue initiative, we launched about 3 years ago, and we're really focused on educating employers and providing them with the resources they need to effectively manage fatigue in the workplace. So in this webinar today, we have a lot of content to go over. And as Kendall said, there will be a recording available for you if you want to go back and catch other pieces. I will be going through slides pretty quickly to cover all of our content. But today we're really going to talk about fatigue as an impairment in the workplace, on the roads. We'll talk about the causes and effects of fatigue, how it affects your body, what that means for safety. We'll talk about how to manage fatigue in the workplace. I'm actually going to share with you some new resources that we just released last month. We're really excited about those. So let's start off by talking about fatigue as an impairment. So most of us recognize that fatigue affects our productivity. We know that when we're tired, we work a little bit slower. We're more likely to make mistakes. Fatigue is one of those human factors that really affects all of us almost every day. And because it's a human factor that's almost unavoidable, it's a factor in all of our workplaces. One study found that tired employees are actually up to 6% less productive than employees that are getting proper sleep. So for a worker that is just not getting 7 hours of sleep a day, maybe they're just getting 5 or 6 hours for whatever reason, they're going to lose about 4 days a year in what we call presenteeism. That's where they're present at work, but not as productive as it would be if they were getting proper rest. So the average person just not getting enough sleep is going to lose about 4 days a year. But for somebody that has an untreated sleep disorder, such as insomnia, studies show that they actually lose 11 days a year in presenteeism, where they're present at work but are not as productive as they would be if they were getting proper rest. And again, the reasons for that is because we are just slower when we're tired and we don't make the best decisions. But what we are most concerned with is how fatigue affects our safety. In 2014, a meta-analysis was conducted, and this is where they gather all of the available research on a specific topic. And they actually found that 13% of workplace injuries could be attributed to employees with sleep problems. And I've actually had several people, several researchers tell me that they think that this is an underestimate, that fatigue is likely involved in a lot more incidents and injuries in the workplace than we even realize. I'd like to point out to employers, these are just a few of the occupational, disasters that have occurred that could be related back to tired workers. So the meltdown at 3 Mile Island occurred at 4 a.m. That's a time when our bodies want us to be asleep and not alert and awake at work, right? The NASA Shuttle Challenger, the workers had less than 2 hours of sleep when that disaster occurred. And then if you're familiar or not with the Tracy Morgan crash, Tracy Morgan's limo bus was rear-ended by a trucker who was extremely sleep deprived. So these are really just a few examples of some disasters that could be attributed to tired employees. But I mentioned Tracy Morgan here specifically because drowsy driving is an issue that I like to pay particular attention with our employers. Many employees drive as part of their job, at least at some point, but most Americans drive to and from work. So this is really, drowsy driving is really an issue that should be at top of mind for employers when they're thinking about safety. And NHTSA does recognize drowsy driving as one of the 4 Ds of impaired driving, with the other impaired driving being drugged driving, drunk driving, distracted driving, and as we're discussing, drowsy driving. So we do recognize that drowsy driving is a form of impairment. There's actually a lot of research out there that compares being drowsy to being intoxicated from alcohol. This study shows us that a driver who has had about 4 to 5 hours of sleep, they're actually 4 times more likely to crash than a driver who had a full 7 or 8 hours of sleep. So losing even just a couple of hours can affect you and affect your crash rate. And this is actually the same crash risk as having a 0.08 blood alcohol level. So a lot of us couldn't imagine allowing our employees to drive if we knew they were intoxicated. But many of us don't think twice about letting our employees drive if we knew that they had lost sleep the night before. But they actually have the same exact crash risk. And in a little bit, we'll talk about performance effects and compare the performance effects of being drowsy to being intoxicated. But to continue on talking about drowsy driving, I wanted to share this study with you. NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, is a federal group that investigates large, often fatal crashes. They did an investigation where they looked at, I believe it was 10 years of their accident investigations, and they actually found that 20% of their investigations identified fatigue as either a probable cause, a contributing factor, or a finding. And when they drilled into their highway crashes, they found that fatigue was a factor in 40% of their highway crashes. So what I like to tell our employers, given everything I've talked about, we don't think fatigue is a problem in the workplace. We don't think fatigue affects safety. There is decades and decades of research, thousands of studies that show a tired worker is more likely to get involved in an incident at work. They're more likely to get hurt on the job. So we don't think fatigue is an issue. We know it's an issue. And we're really trying to change the conversation to what do we do about it. I also want to share this stat with you. This was a recent AAA Foundation study, and they found that 21% of all fatal crashes in the United States likely involved a drowsy driver. So again, we know that fatigue is playing a large part in a lot of our incidents and our fatalities out there. So when we launched our fatigue initiative a few years back, we were really interested in getting a better understanding of just how widespread fatigue was in the workplace. So we actually conducted 2 national surveys. We released those surveys in a 3-part series of reports, and I have the URL up here if you're interested. But in those surveys, we asked about 2,010 working Americans about their risk factors for fatigue, how much sleep they were getting, how many hours they were working, even, how long their commute was. We also asked those working Americans if they'd ever experienced any safety critical incidents caused by fatigue. So in addition to doing the survey of working Americans, we also surveyed employers, specifically HR professionals that had some sort of decision-making and shift scheduling. And we asked those employers very similar questions about risk factors in the operations, such as shift scheduling practices, and we asked them about safety critical incidents that have occurred in the workplace due to tired employees. So we released those results in a 3-part series of reports that are really meant to be part informational with the statistics that we found and the prevalence, but there's also a lot of educational information in there about fatigue in the workplace. So go ahead and check those out. Those are free resources, but I'm going to share some of the results from those studies with you all today. One of the biggest findings and most shocking, honestly, of those 2010 working Americans, we found that 97% of them had at least one risk factor for fatigue. And we figured that you working Americans may be a little bit at risk for fatigue, but we were really shocked when we had 97% of those survey participants state that they had at least one risk factor. And even above and beyond that, we found that 80% had 2 or more risk factors for fatigue. So we know that our working Americans are really suffering from this issue. We found that 43% of those working Americans reported sleeping less than the recommended 7 hours a day. So that's almost half of our workforce in America that's working with some level of fatigue impairment. We also asked those working Americans if they'd ever, fallen asleep on the job. 27% of working Americans said that they had fallen asleep on the job unintentionally in the past month. A quarter of our workforce is falling asleep at work just in the past month. I know it's cut off a little bit here, but we found that 16% of working Americans said they had fallen asleep behind the wheel in the past month. And then 41% said that they had fallen asleep unintentionally outside of their job and outside of the road. So again, that really shows us that our working Americans are suffering from this issue. National Sleep Foundation was also interested in how many people were falling asleep behind the wheel. And they found that 37% of drivers admitted to falling asleep while driving in the past year. So this is really concerning for us, especially when you think that, driving is the most safety-sensitive task you're going to do all day. And for people to be literally falling asleep while they're driving is really concerning. And anytime that you're on the highway, if you could just think about, going 65, 70 miles per hour and the guy next to you or behind you is dozing off, very concerning for all of us, right? So we talked a little bit about the survey data from those working Americans, but I wanted to share some of the information that we gathered from those 504 employers that we surveyed about risk factors in their operation and safety critical incidents that they've witnessed in the workplace. We found that 90% of the employers that we surveyed reported being negatively impacted by fatigue in some way, and I'm going to break this down for you. We found that 47% of employers have experienced decreased productivity in the workplace due to tired employees. About 50% of employers have had an employee fall asleep on the job. 57% of employers report absenteeism or missed days of work due to tired employees. And most concerning for us, 32% of employers report injuries or near misses due to tired employees. And that's really a number that we don't need to be okay with. There are things that we can do There are controls, programs, procedures that we can implement in the workplace so that we can drive that number down. Employees don't need to be so tired at work that they are getting hurt. And I'll share with you some resources that we have available towards the end. I also like to talk with our employers a little bit about the cost of fatigue, because I don't think this is something that employers pay attention to or really acknowledge or understand, but fatigue is very expensive for the employer. So we actually worked with Harvard Medical a few years ago to anticipate these costs. We found that a single employee with a sleep problem costs an employer about $3,500 a year in lost productivity, absenteeism or missed days of work, and increased health care costs. So for an employer that has about 700 employees, they can expect to pay about $1 million a year just to sustain those tired employees. So if you're wondering what that could look like for your workforce, we actually worked with Harvard's team to create a fatigue cost calculator. This is a free online tool that employers can go in, enter some information about their workplace, and really get a tailored estimate of how much fatigue is costing them. And I have an example here for you all. This is what the calculator looks like. So for my example, you put in where your facilities are located. I chose nationwide. You put in what industry or occupational group you employ. And for this example, I have in a construction company. And then how many employees you have. For this example, I put 250. And then if you work on a shift schedule, we have it on there. So for this small construction company, they can expect to pay almost $400,000 a year just to sustain tired employees. And the calculator will actually break it down by what you're incurring costs for, whether that be absenteeism, decreased productivity to the tune of $180,000 a year, and increased healthcare costs. The calculator will also estimate the prevalence of sleep disorders in your workplace. Sleep disorders are far more common than employers realize, and they can be very expensive if they go untreated. So we talked about fatigue as an impairment, but I want to go on to our next part of this presentation, talk about the causes and effects of fatigue in the workplace. And I'm actually going to start with the effects. And we really look at four different, not stages, but we really look at four different types of effects of fatigue on the worker. The first thing that fatigue is going to affect is your cognitive function. You're just not able to think as clearly when you're tired. And there's actually a lot of research out there that demonstrates that humans don't recognize when they are impaired due to fatigue. We just don't recognize it. We don't realize that we're that tired or that fatigue is impairing us until we're to the point where we're excessively yawning or we are literally nodding off. That's why these people are finding themselves in the car falling asleep. We don't recognize these early symptoms of fatigue. And so sometimes we refer to these as hidden symptoms of fatigue because of the fact that we can't recognize this impairment in ourselves. So some of the ways that we're impaired, we're going to have decreased attention, decreased memory, decreased concentration, your vigilance is going to be affected, even your impulse control is affected. And this list can go on and on and on and on. I just threw a few things up here for you all, but fatigue and being tired really affects every part of the way that we think. Again, this is very similar to alcohol intoxication. So if your thinking is impaired, your performance is going to be impaired. So this study found that a person who loses about 2 hours of sleep performs similarly to somebody who drank 3 beers. So again, we wouldn't allow an employee to go to work or to get behind the wheel or to do a safety-sensitive task if we knew they drank 3 beers at lunch, right? We just wouldn't allow that to happen. But we often don't think twice about letting an employee do a safety-sensitive task or get behind the wheel if we knew they didn't get great sleep last night. But it's very same in your performance, and it's very similar in your safety risk. So let's talk a little bit about why are we poor drivers when we're tired, and some of those performance effects. When you're driving tired, you're actually going to have a slower reaction time. So if you're coming through an intersection and a car turns left in front of you, you're going to hit the brakes 1 to maybe 3 seconds slower than you would if you were fully alert. And for anybody that's been in a near-miss crash, 1 to 3 second delay on the brake can make all the difference. You're going to have decreased vigilance, so when you're driving, you won't be scanning for hazards as well as you would. You might not see a car blowing the stop sign or the red light and sideswiping you, before it's too late. You're going to have decreased attention. You're going to find your mind wandering. You're going to get easily distracted. And you're also going to have decreased impulse control. So you might be coming up to an intersection and needing to turn left, and in a split second, you think that you can turn left before that car entering the intersection from the opposite direction comes. But you make that split-second decision, realizing, that was the wrong decision to make. So, again, these are very similar performance effects to a drunk driver. But not only is your performance impaired, as we talked a little bit about earlier, we have people that are literally falling asleep while driving. And when you're going, especially high speeds, closing your eyes for even a second, you go a significant difference in that significant distance during that time, which can be really, really scary, knowing that a driver is not paying attention and is not even awake during that period. So we know fatigue impairs our thinking, it impairs our performance, but I want to go a little more in depth into those safety risks on fatigue. We know that fatigue affects our safety. As I mentioned earlier, there are thousands of studies, decades of research that shows a tired worker is more likely to be involved in an incident. They're more likely to get hurt on the job. But I want to share a couple of my favorite studies with you all that really float to the top for me. This study found that tired workers are at a higher risk of injury. So on the left-hand side of this table is the number of hours the worker has slept. So at the top, those workers have slept fewer hours, so less than 5 hours or 5 to 6 hours. And at the bottom are those workers that are sleeping the recommended, 7, 8, or 9 hours. On the right-hand side of this table is the injury incident rate. For how many hours those workers have slept. So as you see at the top of the table, the workers that are sleeping less than 5 hours or 5 to 6 hours have a much higher injury incident rate than those workers at the bottom who are sleeping the recommended amount of hours. And so really the take home here is that the more sleep a worker gets, the less likely they are to get hurt on the job. It's really as simple as that. This study shows that long hours puts workers at risk. So at the bottom, we see the number of hours on shift. So from 4 hours on shift all the way up to 12 hours on shift. And the bars represent their estimated risk of injury. So really, after 8 hours on shift, the risk of injury for these workers really starts to climb. And this table kind of caps out at 12 hours, but we could only imagine if workers are on shift for longer than 12 hours, that risk of injury is really going to start to climb quickly. So I just want to touch a little bit on the health effects of fatigue. Honestly, you could probably spend a whole hour talking about sleep health, but I'm just going to touch on it here. We know that sleep loss negatively impacts our health, and it's really related to a host of different issues, even premature death for those people that are not getting at least 7 hours of sleep a day. But it's also really costly for both the employee and the employer when they're dealing with these health effects of sleep loss. So for an employer, it's going to be about $3,000 per employee per year in increased healthcare costs because tired employees are going to be impacted negatively. Their health is going to be impacted negatively, unfortunately. So let's shift over and talk about the causes of fatigue in the workplace. And we look at 3 different kinds of causes or types of causes of fatigue in the workplace. But I really want to drive home that sleep loss is above and beyond the major cause of fatigue. If you're not getting at least 7 hours of sleep a day, you're going to have some level of sleep loss, and you might be chronically sleep deprived if you aren't regularly sleeping at least 7 hours a day. So why aren't people getting enough sleep? Maybe they're not prioritizing sleep. I know if you have a family, if you have small children, if you are taking care of maybe your elderly parents, sometimes it can be hard to get enough sleep. But we also know that our work schedules can interfere with sleep. If we have employees that are working 12 or more hours a day, that's really going to impact the time that they have off in order to get proper sleep. And then finally, we know that untreated sleep disorders can be a huge barrier for people getting proper sleep. Even if they're laying in bed for 8 hours, if they're not getting quality sleep, they're going to be fatigued. The Institutes of Medicine believe that between 50 to 70 million people in the United States have a sleep disorder, and up to 90% of those are undiagnosed and untreated. So people are living their lives either not realizing that they are suffering from a sleep disorder, or maybe they perceive some kind of barriers to getting treatment. And we find with people with untreated sleep disorders, once they get treatment, it is a night and day difference on their lives. If you've ever talked to somebody who had obstructive sleep apnea and then got a CPAP machine, I mean, they just rave about the difference that it makes. There's really two of the most common sleep disorders, especially that we deal with in the workplace. And that's obstructive sleep apnea is the main one. We mostly see this in men, and it's really associated with a myriad of chronic diseases, even early death. And then insomnia is another pretty prevalent sleep disorder. Mostly see this in women, but it also has their multiple health issues that come along with this. So I'm going to talk about a little bit later about how employers are providing sleep health education and sleep disorder screening in the workplace to help employees identify if they're at risk and then help them get treatment. So we talked about sleep loss being the major cause of fatigue in the workplace, but there's two other causes that I want to touch on. The next one being circadian rhythm misalignment, and this really just refers to working at night when your body wants you to be asleep, and then trying to sleep during the day. So the period between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., in aviation they call this the window of circadian low. And this is really when your body is pumping out melatonin, telling you to sleep. So if you're trying to work between this period, you're going to have some level of reduced alertness. Even if you got a full 7-hour sleep before your shift, you're going to still have some amount of reduced alertness. But our night shift workers and even our early morning shifters kind of get a double whammy of fatigue because they're dealing with the circadian rhythm misalignment, but they're also required to sleep during the day, which is really hard for our bodies to do. You know, it's bright outside. Our families might be up and moving around. Neighbors are mowing the lawn. There's the garbage pickup. There's all sorts of barriers for night shift workers to get sleep during the day. And so not only are they dealing with circadian rhythm misalignment, they're also dealing with sleep deprivation. In our survey of working Americans, we found that 59% of night shift workers sleep less than 7 hours a day versus 45% of our day shift workers. So we really know that our night shift workers and even our early morning shifters are really a special population when it comes to fatigue that we really need to consider. The last cause of fatigue I want to talk about is work or task demands. And this really comes down to what the job is and what's the job environment. So there's a few different aspects to this we can call out. One is time on task fatigue. Really boring or unstimulating tasks can cause us to be a little more tired or sleepy than we may usually be. Sometimes you see this when you're driving a long, boring stretch of road. We call that highway hypnosis. but also tasks that are really mentally demanding or really stimulating are really hard for us to maintain our attention and our vigilance on for a long period of time. So there's kind of two sides of the spectrum, right? The really boring tasks, but also the really demanding tasks, both of which can kind of induce fatigue in a worker. The environment that the work is being done in plays a part here. If it's really noisy, if there's poor air quality, if there's poor temperature, either really hot or really cold, or if there's poor lighting, all of those factors can weigh into make an employee feel more tired than they would if there were more temperate or nicer conditions. And then the last one here I'll mention is shift scheduling practices. And this is really a huge factor when it comes to workplace fatigue. What I like to tell our employers is when you're scheduling shifts, you really need to recognize that you are not only scheduling time on shift, but you're scheduling the amount of time that the worker has off shift in order to get proper rest. So if you have workers that are working 12 or 14-hour shifts, they might not have enough opportunity to get proper rest. They might not be able to get the 7 hours of sleep before they show up for their shift. So there's a number of different practices here that you can look at when you're scheduling your shifts to really ensure that your workers are able to get proper sleep and are not necessarily working against their circadian rhythm. This is an infographic that we have on our website that I kind of blocked out, but it looks at some of those risky work schedules. We know that our night shifters, they're at risk because of the time of day that they're working and they're not able to get proper sleep during the day, but also our early morning shifters can be really affected by this as well. We know that employees on long shifts are disproportionately affected by fatigue. Those that are doing rotating shifts or even irregular shifts can be affected by fatigue just because those types of shifts require a change in your patterns. You're having to set new behaviors, new bedtime schedule, new routine. That can all be really hard on our bodies and can really put us at risk for fatigue and fatigue-related incidents in the workplace. So we talked about the causes and effects of fatigue and how fatigue is an impairment, but let's switch gears and talk about how you can effectively manage fatigue in the workplace. And I want to point out here that fatigue can both be managed at home and in the workplace. So there's really responsibility for the employee and the employer here. But what we recommend is a fatigue risk management system. And that's really policies, practices, programs, and procedures that incorporates fatigue risk management into an already existing safety management system. And so that can sound kind of complicated, but when you really boil it down, it's about identifying and minimizing the factors that are causing fatigue in your workplace in order to control those health and safety risks. So why are your workers tired? And what can you do to fix it is really what this boils down to. But we have a ton of resources for you all if you're interested in learning more about fatigue in the workplace and fatigue risk management systems, including the new toolkit that we just came out with. But I want to show you a little bit about a report that we released this past February that really gives a high-level overview of what a fatigue risk management system is and what some of those vital components are. So I have a URL up here for you that you can jot down, but I'm going to walk through this report kind of quickly for you. We recognize 5 sections to an effective fatigue risk management system, the first one being education and training. And really one of the most effective pieces of the education and training that you can implement is a sleep health program. And that's a program that that's a program that provides sleep health education, but also screens employees for sleep disorders and really helps them get treatment for those sleep disorders. And I'm going to give you a quick case study here for you all about a company that has really done this successfully. So Schneider Trucking, they implemented their sleep health. It's actually an obstructive sleep apnea program. They implemented it, I think, back in 2006. They created their own screening tool for obstructive sleep apnea and really worked with some big-named sleep scientists to really ensure they were accurately identifying it and doing everything they could to ensure that their workers could be compliant with treatment, which was a CPAP machine. They have had a lot of university researchers come through and evaluate their program just because of how large it was and how successful it was. So I'm going to share some of the results with you all. They found that their drivers with untreated obstructive sleep apnea had 5 times the crash risk as those drivers who had obstructive sleep apnea but were being compliant with their treatment. They also found that obstructive sleep apnea treatment resulted in a 73% reduction in their preventable crashes. And they have about 15,000 drivers on the road. So imagine what that does for their safety data, right, when they have a 73% reduction in their preventable crashes. But they also found some savings in their healthcare spending. The obstructive sleep apnea treatment program resulted in almost a 50% reduction in their per member per month healthcare spending. So we know that the education and training, especially sleep health education and screening, can be really effective at treating tired employees and really mitigating some of those fatigue risks that they may be introducing. The next part to a fatigue risk management system is implementing policies and practices. And this could really, there's a number of things that you could do under this category. The first thing people tend to think about is limiting number of hours on shift, which can be effective, but it's really not the end-all, be-all for policies and practices in fatigue risk management. You could also look at putting limits on the number of consecutive night shifts or the number of consecutive early morning shifts. So the purpose of that is really to ensure that those workers working on those hard shifts have ample opportunity to get proper rest. We want to make sure that they have time off between shifts, and then they have plenty of time off between these consecutive shifts that are a little bit harder on the body so that they can get a full night's sleep. We'd really like to see them getting night sleep. Shared responsibility is really about having a culture that recognizes fatigue as a hazard in the workplace, and it's really about having a culture that recognizes the responsibility of the employer in providing ample rest opportunity and recognizing the responsibility of the employee in using that rest opportunity to get rest and arrive for their shift alert and fit for duty. And if you go to our report, we actually have a really nice table that breaks down the responsibility of the employers and the related responsibility of the employees. So go ahead and check that section out if you want to learn more about shared responsibility. Fatigue mitigation, this part of a fatigue risk management system recognizes that no matter how many prevention methods you put into place, sometimes employees are going to be tired on their shift, and what can you do about it? So in this section, we talk a little bit about the strategic use of caffeine, of rest breaks, of nap opportunities, of physical activity, and even how a little bit of socializing around the water cooler can really help mitigate fatigue in the workplace. The final section to a fatigue risk management system is data-driven programs and continuous improvement. And this really is about putting data collection into place so that you know what could be causing or contributing to fatigue in your workplace so that you can implement those controls or those programs to help mitigate some of that fatigue. So that's really what the overall structure of a fatigue risk management system should look like, and you can see that high-level view in this report. But over the past year or two, we've actually been developing resources in each of these categories for employers to begin implementing fatigue risk management systems. So we are really excited to have released this Fatigue at Work Employer Toolkit. So most of these items are free of charge. There are a few items that are designated to National Safety Council members only. So you'd have to check and see if your company is an NSC member. But the large part of these resources are free and open to the public. So these resources will help you implement fatigue risk management in your workplace. And we really have the kit divided into 4 different sections that, again, mimic what we just talked about in our report. And then each section has a video introduction. I do the video introduction on there that talks a little bit about what's in the kit, how you can use the kit, and how those resources can relate to other parts of the kit. But I'm going to show you what each of those sections look like and what some of those resources are. So in the education and training section, this is really our largest section in the toolkit. We have a ton of resources for you all. All of these resources are free, whether or not you're a National Safety Council member. So go ahead and check those out. But we really address 3 topic areas. We have resources on sleep health, we have resources on drowsy driving, and we have resources on workplace fatigue specifically. The ones I want to point out here, some of the most exciting pieces to this is we actually worked with Pulsar Informatics, who is a fatigue risk management consulting company, to create an online training video specifically about workplace fatigue. And this can be used for both management and non-management, and it really goes over the science of what causes fatigue in the workplace, and what you can do to mitigate some of that fatigue. So it's a great resource for you all to use as part of maybe a safety talk or a safety stand down, or we even have employers that have talked about using this as part of their onboarding for employees. So go ahead and check those resources out under the education and training section. Under policies and practices, the most exciting piece in here is really our program manual template. So we worked with Pulsar Informatics to create these huge documents. They're about 60 pages long, and it's really meant to be a plug and play for beginning to implement fatigue risk management, beginning to implement some policies in the workplace. So these program manual templates that we made with Pulsar, these are National Safety Council member benefits. So you might not have access to that if you're not a member, but in this section we also have infographics and some fact sheets that help educate you and your managers more about effective policies and practices in the workplace. Under the shared responsibility section, if you remember, this is kind of that cultural piece and about what is the role of employers and the role of employees. In this section, we have safety talks for you that you can actually tailor based on what is going on in your workplace. So if you are doing a specific campaign around, say, drowsy driving, you can tailor those safety talks so that they're more relevant for what you have going on in your workplace. We also have fact sheets that you can use as a handout after the safety talks. And then we have a poster on shared responsibility, which is really meant to start creating that culture and of fatigue as a hazard in the workplace, and really start to communicate about fatigue in the workplace. And almost all of these sections, I believe, have some really great posters that you can start hanging around your workplace to really start the conversation about fatigue. The data-driven program section, this one has a lot of resources in it as well. The main resource that I would really push for employers to look at, and really is a great starting point, is our assessments that we have in here. So we actually created these assessments a few years ago. We partnered with some of our top-tier EHS companies, and we developed some questionnaires that would help the employers, these companies, identify what could be causing or contributing fatigue in their workplace. So there's an operational assessment that asks you questions about components of your operations, such as shift scheduling practices. There's also a fatigue risk management audit in there, so you can identify what components you may already have in place or what components you should begin implementing. But under that assessment, we also have employee survey questions that you can use in your workplace to survey your employees and get a better understanding of their thoughts, actions, and behaviors around sleep health. We ask about how much sleep that they're getting, how motivated they are to get good sleep, how important it is for them. But there's also some culture questions in there. So we ask questions such as, do you think your employer sees fatigue as a hazard? Do you think your employer cares about fatigue? We ask, do you think that if you were tired at work, would you feel comfortable coming to your supervisor and tell them that you were tired? Or would you feel comfortable reporting your fatigue if you didn't feel safe doing a safety-sensitive task, for example? So it can really help you identify if you have some cultural barriers to implementing fatigue in the workplace. So go ahead and check those assessments out. It's a great starting point for you if you're looking to implement fatigue risk management in your workplace. But also under this tab, we have incident reporting information. So that's another good place to start. In your incident reporting, you can be asking questions about fatigue and sleep health so you can start to understand how fatigue is impacting some of the incidents that are occurring in your workplace. And then the final item in here is a signs and symptoms checklist. And we really see this as a way to help educate employees on signs and symptoms of fatigue so that they can start to self-identify if they could be impaired due to fatigue in the workplace. So go ahead and check that item out. The toolkit is really meant to, you can either use these pieces a la carte. You can pick up and implement the posters and then maybe next month do some safety talks, or you can implement the whole toolkit at the same time, which is really meant to be a comprehensive fatigue risk management system. And the reason we are kind of offering it a la carte and as a comprehensive system is we know that a lot of employers might not be ready to fully jump into a fatigue risk management system. But maybe you can implement some of these small components and really dip your toe in the water and really see if this is something that you would be interested in, implementing on a wider scale at some point. So feel free to download and pick some of these pieces out and really start somewhere, because we'd rather you start small and build than be too afraid to even implement a single piece of this. So really think about what would be best for your workplace and implement what works best for you. So that is all the information I have for today, but I really want to stress, if you have any questions or suggestions, I always welcome emails. I always tell our employers my job is to create resources for you all. So if you let me know what would be helpful, that would help me do my job better. But at this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Kendall, who's going to lead us in Q&A.
Thank you for a great presentation today, Emily. That does conclude the presentation portion of today's event. We will now begin our Q&A session. If you have not yet submitted your questions, please do so at this time. Okay, Emily, our first question for today. What are some best practices in shift scheduling?
Great. So this is actually a question that I get a lot from employers. Sometimes they'll give me their shift schedule and say, is that okay? What should we change? And what I really like to stress for our employers is that shift scheduling is really kind of an art and a practice. You need to make sure that your shifts allow you to run your operations, right? But there's also some sort of best practices that can act as parameters in how you schedule your shifts. And we have a fact sheet on the site that would be really helpful for you all. But when you're thinking about your shift scheduling, if you're doing a rotating shift, the research shows that it's best to rotate forward with the clock. So have people on a day shift to an evening shift to a night shift to a day shift. And we also recommend slow rotation. So have somebody on a specific shift for 2 weeks, for example, before they rotate to the next shift, versus a quick rotation where they may be rotating different shift types every couple of days. We really prefer the slower rotation. The other thing that you should be considering is limiting the number of hours that they're on shift. As we saw in that chart earlier, once you get beyond really 10 hours on shift, that risk of injury really starts to climb. But also think about the number of hours they have off between shifts. We would really like to see employers implement policies that say employees need to have at least 12 hours off between shifts to give them ample rest opportunity. You can also consider limiting the number of consecutive shifts in a row. So for example, night shifts are really hard, and we would like to see people doing no more than 4 consecutive night shifts in a row before they get 24 to even 48 hours off in order to get proper rest. So think about some of those best practice parameters and see if you can work your shift in a way that covers your operations, but also ensures that your employees, have the best chances for arriving to work alert and fit for duty.
Great. Our next question. What do you suggest in the agricultural industry when we have to load a train for 18 plus hours a day and work a normal day on both sides? I don't think our employer recognizes fatigue, but it takes a toll on your mental health, work-home balance, etc. What can I do as an employee to bring this up?
Good question, and those are just crazy work hours, I have to say. As we saw in that chart, when somebody's on shift for, honestly, at 10 hours, that risk of injury really starts to climb. And again, we want to make sure that our employees have ample time off between shifts in order to get proper rest. So what I would say from an employee perspective, maybe you can find some way to provide some educational materials, maybe go through some of our resources that we have on our website and see if you can find something that you may be able to send to your employer or your manager or even your HR that can help inform them about some of those barriers. I do like to say to our employers, there are ways to schedule shifts that make it safe for everybody. You don't have to sacrifice operations in order to have alert employees. There's ways to do both. So browse the website. In the toolkit specifically, there's a tab at the beginning that's called Getting Started. I believe that's what they named it, Getting Started. And it has some of that kind of background information about why fatigue is a problem, why fatigue is a safety risk. You could always try to send that over to your manager, your supervisor, or your HR and see if that can spark a discussion on the topic.
Okay, our next question. You mentioned caffeine. When it comes to energy drinks and coffee, would you say that they are a help or a hindrance to long-term rest health?
Great question. So this almost always comes up because we are a nation of overly caffeinated people, right? So ideally, caffeine, and research shows caffeine can be really effective in boosting alertness in the short term. However, caffeine can be easily abused, and it ends up having more detrimental effects. So I'll say the strategic use of caffeine can be effective in helping you get through, say, the end of your shift or get through a safety-sensitive task with more alertness. However, we know that most Americans are not using caffeine strategically, and they are abusing caffeine. And so what happens is they often find themselves unable to fall asleep at night, whether or not they recognize it's tied back to their caffeine use, or they can have health complications due to drinking too much caffeine. So National Safety Council doesn't necessarily recommend caffeine just because of the fact that we're so used to abusing it as a culture. So I know that's not a big answer to your questions, but really just some food for thought. I would say if you're finding this issue in your workplace a lot, I think maybe some education around it would be really helpful. Either you could tap into our Fatigue in the Workplace training video that we have, or maybe even look into a sleep health education course because it will talk about how caffeine affects your sleep.
Thank you, Emily. That is all the time that we have for our questions today. I want to thank everyone for their participation. If your question was not answered during our Q&A session, it will be sent forward to our presenter, and she will answer them at a later time. And that is all that we have for our presentation today. I want to go ahead and thank our sponsors, M&M Specialty Services and VAA LLC, for their support in bringing you today's webinar. I also want to thank GEAPS and our presenter, Emily Whitcomb, for joining us today. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and it will be available for viewing on grainnet.com within 24 hours. All registrants will also receive an email containing a link to the webinar recording. Our next webinar with GEAPS will be held on Wednesday, November 13th at 2 p.m. Central Time. Dr. Kurt Rosentrader of Iowa State University will be discussing facility design, maximizing efficiency and throughput. I want to thank you all for attending, and I want to wish you all a great day.